אנחנו הולמים באויבינו בעוצמה חסרת תקדים.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this morning saying the week-long retaliation on Gaza is just the beginning. He says our enemies have only begun paying the price. Tens of thousands of civilians are on the move after Israel issued a stark warning overnight to leave the north of the Strip within 24 hours in anticipation of an expected ground assault against Hamas terrorists. A hospital in Gaza says it only has until morning to move sick and wounded patients. Palestinians in Gaza say they're terrified.
I'm actually terrified. I'm trying not to show it, but it's all the situation around us. It's like they're saying that you could die at any moment. You don't know if I don't even know if I'm going to live for the next minute.
Leaflets rained over Gaza this morning, dropped by Israeli military planes, reading, "For your safety, don't return to your homes until further notice."
The situation in Gaza has reached a dangerous new low.
More than 400,000 Palestinians have already left their homes. At least 1,900 have been killed in retaliatory airstrikes. The United Nations begging Israel to go back on its threat, saying a mass exodus of more than 1 million people will cause a humanitarian catastrophe.
Moving more than 1 million people across a densely populated war zone to a place with no food, water, or accommodation, when the entire territory is under siege, is extremely dangerous and in some cases simply not possible.
The UN has moved its refugee headquarters south. Meanwhile, thousands of Palestinians across the West Bank marched through the streets in solidarity with Gaza. And they weren't the only ones. Demonstrations were held in cities around the world, answering the call for global protests and unrest. Protesters burning Israeli flags in Baghdad and clashing with police. All of this coming as Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister travels to Tel Aviv to show Ottawa's support for Israel and push for a humanitarian corridor into Gaza to help protect civilians. Global Affairs says Canadian Armed Forces flights have evacuated 236 people from the region, and 2 additional flights are scheduled for the weekend. Global Affairs says there may be an opportunity for the 150 Canadian citizens in Gaza to leave the besieged enclave through the Egyptian border tomorrow, but the plan is still tentative. Jolie's American counterpart, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, also in Tel Aviv today, meeting with Israeli troops.
The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group is now in the region, led by the largest aircraft carrier in the world. We've augmented U.S. fighter aircraft squadrons in the Middle East.
He promised that the states are ready to deploy more military might if needed. For more on the war, let's bring in Jeannie Sowers. She's the chair of the Political Science and International Affairs Department at the University of New Hampshire in Durham, New Hampshire. Jeannie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This order for civilians to leave North Gaza, how will this change the humanitarian situation in the Strip?
That's a great question. I think the consensus is that it's going to worsen the humanitarian situation because it's really not possible for 1.1 million people to relocate to southern Gaza. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the UN agency responsible for Palestinian refugees, has announced that it has moved its operations to southern Gaza. So it is trying to comply with that order. I think the more interesting question, too, is not just humanitarian access, but safe passage out of Gaza. This seems to me to be the priority.
If indeed there is a ground assault into North Gaza, how much will that change the nature of this war?
Right. So I think, unfortunately, I think the widespread understanding is that a ground conflict will be very costly for both sides. And I think that it would be wise for all parties to actually sort of slow down and think about how to do that to minimize civilian casualties. I think the U.S. is starting to open those discussions, both with the Egyptians and the Israelis. I'm sure the Israelis are also having their internal discussions about how to do that. But I would say that so far it's been very sobering, and the fact that we have atrocities committed by Hamas, and now we have actually war crimes also being unleashed on the population of Palestinians in Gaza, means that everyone should really try now to de-escalate and figure out a way to actually, there is a way, right, to let women, children, elderly, the sick, the wounded exit Gaza. And that could be also a corridor to the West Bank, which no one has talked about. The West Bank is not far away. And that would obviously be a logistical challenge, but that's another solution that could be proposed.
There were more clashes on the Lebanese border today and rising tensions in the West Bank. How likely do you think a regional war is at this stage?
I think many groups are aware, both state actors and non-state actors, that intensifying this to some sort of regional conflict would actually have dire consequences for everyone involved. I think that the more immediate challenge is actually to de-escalate the threats of sort of this clearing of the Gaza Strip. And so it would be sort of behoove everybody involved to sort of really seriously consider the humanitarian consequences before intensifying escalations. For Hezbollah, they've had a long series of clashes with the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. And of course, that at a period of time, there was the occupation of southern Lebanon. So I think that is a situation that both Hezbollah and Israel would like to avoid. So both sides have an incentive for restraint.
How do you think the U.S. can balance supporting Israel while also supporting the humanitarian needs of Palestinians in Gaza? Is there a way?
Absolutely. I think there is a way. And I think the way is actually laid out in international humanitarian law, which is that the justness of a cause or of a war or of responding to an attack, in other words, a defensive response, still obligates you to follow international humanitarian law, which talks about the conduct of war. So I think the U.S. has very clearly stated that it feels that Israel has the right to respond. And I think that that's actually a fairly unanimous opinion. The question is how you respond. And that's where international humanitarian law has very clear guidelines, right? So there is military necessity, but that has to be balanced by proportionality and distinction.
That's Jeannie Sowers. She's the chair of the Political Science and International Affairs Department at the University of New Hampshire in Durham, New Hampshire. Jeannie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.